Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to take a close look at making composite images. Now composites can be as simple as just replacing a sky or another element in an image, or as complicated as making a whole new image out of very different and disparate elements. So let's have a look at a couple of examples and we'll work through how to make them. Let's get started. So firstly, let's have a look at what composite images really are. And starting with a very simple example, it could be just as simple as merely replacing the sky in an image, as in this one, or in this example that I've used previously, or even in this example where a bland sky was replaced with something with a little more information in it. But of course we can move on a little more from that and we can add more elements. And in this case, this is the cover from a book I made on the ill-fated André expedition to the pole in 1897, and I used an image that was taken from the original launch and added it to an image of mine that was taken a few years ago in the high Arctic. And of course we can use this to make all sorts of composite images that would not be possible any other way. And there are other options such as replacing skies with things like a plain texture that add more of an artistic effect, and so we can move on to using some of the tools of composite image making that will allow us to expand our creativity. And the most important thing to remember when you're creating composites is that there is no rules. Everything's possible. People that want to start to sort of say you can't do that because this is not what the camera saw, this is just entirely rubbish. Photography is all about expressing your creativity, and making composites is one way that we can expand our creativity beyond simply what the camera records. So moving on from that, you can have a bit of fun by adding elements that definitely don't belong. This series of king penguins was taken from Antarctica and placed in a park in Australia. So a bit of fun, and you can create all sorts of things depending on what your imagination can do. And of course we can also create stories and add mood and influence the viewers thinking about what we're trying to present them. And this is an image from a series I made on the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, and there are a number of different elements and techniques blended together, and we'll cover these a little bit more as we move through. And of course the second thing that we should be aware of when you're putting composite images together is that the elements that you add to the image should enhance the image and should fit together, and particularly when it comes to things like viewpoint, perspective, and the way the lighting is treated. Now these ones are fairly simple, but as you get into more complicated images you need to bear all of those things in mind. And we can use things like texture and color overlays to blend the elements together even though they were taken from many different sources. And this is another one from that series on the fall of communism. And even then making more complicated images, again using elements that blend together. And of course all of the elements that you add together need to add to the story, and you need to have in mind before you start some idea of what you're trying to achieve. This was made up from a number of different elements, and we'll step through this a little bit later, but you need to have a plan of how you want the image to look, so that as you work together and put things into a composite, you need to know what the end result ought to look like. And often when you're adding elements together, one of the keys is to avoid having sharply defined edges where two elements meet. It's often better to have a slightly softer edge so that you can make it look a little more realistic. And obviously things like this are not going to be passed off as being a real image. The viewer should be aware that what you're presenting is a composite image. You're telling a story with your photographs, and they should be aware that that's the case. And in these images here that I made, I wanted to create the semblance of some sort of early primitive life form in the deep ocean, and these were made up of elements that were totally constructed from almost nothing, and added textures and lighting to make it look realistic. And so you can have a lot of fun, and you can have a lot of creativity to produce these images. So let's have a look at a few of them now and see how they went together. So looking at a very simple composite image, here's an example where I just merely did the replacement of the sky, and using Photoshop's sky replacement tools, it was quite simple. So let's go back and look at the original image. It was captured against a very clear blue sky that we often get in Australia, but of course it was a little bit boring, and I was interested in the rainbow lorikeets, and I wanted to add a little bit more drama to the sky. So the first thing I did, this was photographed with a 600mm lens, and the depth of field was a little bit marginal. So the first thing I did was I used the selective sharpen tool, the 25-25-0 unsharp mask, to try and bring a little bit of this back into focus, or apparent focus, which it did. And so this was my starting off point. And then I merely used the sky replacement tool in Photoshop, which I'll just close that existing one up, and let's just step through it. Edit, sky replacement. And if you haven't got the latest version of Photoshop, I highly recommend that you update to the subscription model, because it works incredibly well and there are some fantastic tools. Now obviously when it comes to replacing the sky, you need to replace it with something that looks appropriate, and that's one of our first ideas, or not rules, but considerations when making composite images, is what you add to the image needs to look appropriate. Now that big stormy sky obviously looks totally wrong, and just using some of Photoshop's built-in sky replacements, you could go to something like that, or even this one gives you a little bit more interest in the sky. I think in fact that I use one of my own skies in this image, and there are a number of inbuilt skies in Photoshop's sky replacement filter, and of course you can also use your own. So let's go back and just select one of the Photoshop ones for now. I think something like this one looks okay, so let's just allow that to do the automatic selection, and it will then replace the sky and blend it in. Now there's a little bit of a mistake here that the selection tools missed out, and we can simply go in and correct that by, in the sky replacement group that Photoshop creates, you have a number of things like a curves adjustment, a foreground lighting mask that amends the lighting to suit the background sky that you've added, and of course the sky replacement itself with a mask. And if I click on that mask, you'll see that there's quite a strong selection there, and if we wanted to include this little bit of blue area into the sky that it was missed out, well, we just simply have to paint onto this mask with our brush tool, and using white as our foreground color, and we can just zoom in and fill in that area. Now important that we make sure we're painting on the mask, and of course you can see now the sky that's coming through, and it doesn't need to be super precise, because you can see here that the actual edge of the log here is a little bit out of focus, and we can pick up that bit as well. And if I alt click back on that mask, you'll see that that's what I've painted in, and we can go back to seeing the whole of the sky replaced. Let's just move that back. And so that's a fairly simple technique, and again, choose the right sky that suits your image. That's not the one I ended up with. I used this one of mine because it had a nice bit of cloud that sort of reflected the shape of the birds. So that's a simple composite image using the sky replacement tools. So let's now have a look at one that's quite a lot more complicated, and you'll see the journey that we work through in trying to arrive at the final image. And this is one that I showed a little earlier, which is one of my series from the a series I called Relics of a Failed State, and it speaks to the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, in fact in Hungary. So if we go all the way back to the base image, which was one captured, there is a park just on the outskirts of Budapest, where all of the old communist era statues have been taken away and then re-erected as a bit of a museum, which is a great way to remember the excesses of the communist era. And in the centre there was this large circular planting area with a red star, the communist star, and I liked that idea as a central composition tool. But as you can see, the base image is a little bit lacking. It was a fairly bland sort of a day, and we needed to add something to add to the sense of the story. So the first thing I did was use the Nik Silver Efex Pro to bring out some of the finer detail in the image. You'll see here that I've used one of the filters blended to luminosity and with the opacity dropped back, and I've just used that to enhance some of the detail. Now the important thing here was I felt that the red flowers were a very important part of the image, so I made a selection of the color range to isolate that from the background, and simply we would go up to the select color range tool and we can just sample the colors, and we just have to make sure that we pick those areas pretty carefully, and you'll see that just by picking that out I've managed to select a pretty good area, and I've inadvertently picked some areas in the background I don't want, that orangey sort of a color, and by just clicking and selecting the areas we want, we can end up with a selection that's pretty close to what we need. Now I'll deselect that because I've already made that selection, and on this layer you'll see here's my area that I isolated from the Silver Efex. I didn't want that added to, and so this is my first step, and I had in mind that I wanted to add texture and a bit of grunginess to represent the depression of the communist era. So the first thing I did was add a curves layer just to darken things down a little bit, and this was a journey of exploration, so I started to think about how I would enhance that. The next thing I did was I added a hue saturation layer to bring out the intensity of these reds, and that was quite simply done by choosing the reds channel and pushing up the saturation quite strongly, because I felt that this was an important part of the image. And again, using that selection that I made previously, isolating that just to those flowers. So now I have an area where this red star is being emphasized in the image, and let's move on. And then what I did here was just took a little bit of the color out of the rest of the image, just to dull that green area down a bit. I thought that was too vibrant, and I wanted to enhance the starkness of the red star against the background. So starting to get a little bit more of a feel for what I wanted, and then I decided it needed a fair bit more contrast, so I added a curves layer with a fairly strong contrast just to bring that contrast level up. Again, as I was working through this, thinking about how I would enhance it and add the elements. So I decided that the top of the image was a little too bright, so I just painted in a little bit of a darkening curves adjustment there just to take some of the brightness out of the sky. And of course then I added a vignette using the simple method that I've explained in an earlier video, just to give the edges a little bit of darkness. And then it's starting to get a little bit more of the feel that I was looking for. But then what I decided was I wanted to add a fair bit of grunginess to the image, and so I've used one of the Nik Color Efex Pro images, or filters rather, and so I've used some midnight filter and some tonal contrast just to add to that sort of grunginess sort of a feel. You can see the difference there, starting to get a bit of a feel. But then I thought the color isn't quite what I wanted. I still wanted a bit more bleak, and so what I did here was I used one of the color lookup table filters, and that's using one of the adjustment layers here, a color lookup table. Many people wouldn't have used these, but there are a series of lookup tables built into Photoshop. Let's just pick one. Let's just say here's a very bright autumn look, and it looks pretty terrible at full strength, but of course you need to bring it right back. And so you can add a fairly strong look to an image quite simply using a color lookup table. That's obviously not what I wanted for this image. We'll get rid of that. The one I ended up using here was one called Futuristic Bleak, which is quite a bluey green color, and again I isolated the flowers out of this image. I didn't want the red to be dissipated by this lookup table, and if I it's at 36% opacity. If I took this all the way up, you'll see that it's quite a bluey, bleak, depressing looking color, but it suited the image here. So we had about 36, something like that. So we're getting closer to the look I wanted. Still haven't added the composite elements though. The next thing I did was I added a high pass sharpening layer here to bring out more of this foreground detail, and that's done using the high pass filter. Let's go back up here. We need to make a composite layer, Control Alt Shift and E, and then going to the filters menu, down to other, high pass, and it looks pretty weird at this point. You only need a very small radius, something like around 2 pixels, and then we blend it to overlay blend mode, and this brings out a lot of the fine detail. It's like a mid-tone contrast adjustment. So I've already made that. We can get rid of that example, and you'll see here that in this foreground area it's brought back a lot of grungy sort of fine detail, which I sort of liked in this image. And then moving along, I was getting pretty close now to being able to add those extra elements. Added a slight curves adjustment to brighten it back up again. I thought I went a bit too dark with the other adjustments. And then the next thing I did was I brought in another image of some texture. Now let's just bring it back to normal blend mode. You'll see here that it was a close-up of some text that was written in Hungarian or some other language, so it wasn't really easily readable. It was from also within this park, and what I did was I blended it to overlay blend mode, and using a slight masking around the corners, I just kept some of the detail out of the corners. But what I wanted was the sense of the fractured nature of this regime and some of the text and the propaganda coming through in the background. And of course some wonderful textures. If we look here, some of the textures on that concrete have now come in and added a wonderful texture to the image, particularly in the sky. So we're getting pretty close now, and then quite simply all I did was make a final curves adjustment just to bring the luminosity of the image back to what I wanted. And to me this one told a really good story about the fall of communism. So having completed this image where I wanted a particular grungy textural look, let's have a look at another image now. And I looked at this a little bit earlier, and this is an image that I put together using a contemporary photograph from 1897 with my photograph of the high Arctic to tell part of the story of this expedition. So let's have a look back at where I started from. So here's my original image of the Arctic with the sun trying to peek through the clouds and ice in the foreground. I then used the Silver Effects Pro layer, blended to luminosity to enhance some of the detail and bring out some of the textures, and then enhance that with a little bit of Nik color effects to bring out more of the color in the sky. And then added a little bit of a curves adjustment just to lighten it a little bit, just to prepare this for adding the balloon. So where did I get the balloon? Well, let's have a look here. When we find it, here is the original image. Let's just take that back. This is the original press photograph that was from the expedition. You can see that it's badly damaged and it's not a very good quality. So how could I use this in the image? Well, of course, in the final image, it's quite small, so I could get away with cheating a little bit with the quality. So I made a background copy and enhanced some of the pieces, and then quite simply cut the balloon out using a selection tool, and then finally tweaked it a little bit, made a duplicate of that layer, blended them together, and then I still had a little bit of rubbish in the background, but then I pasted this into a new layer where I just had the balloon sitting against the background, and you'll see that it's pretty low quality. Zoomed in, it's not very good, but can we make this work? Well, let's have a look and see what we did. I have a collection of layers here where we've added the balloon in, and how do we make this work? let's just open up this series of filters, and what we have is, firstly, let's turn all of these off. Firstly, I just added in this balloon cut and pasted from the other image, and because it's quite small in the frame, I could get away with it being fairly low quality. But here's where the technique comes in to help blend it into the background, and that is because the lighting on this balloon was not working with the lighting in this image, I then started to add some lighting into the image. And you can see here, if we zoom in a little bit tighter, first thing I did was add a curves layer where I lightened considerably, clipped this to the layer below, which is the balloon, so I didn't have to worry too much about painting over the sky in the background. And what I did was, just using a brush tool, painted in some sunlight on the side of the balloon that was facing the sun to give that a sense of being a real object. And then conversely, on the other side, I painted in some darkness using a darkening curves adjustment, again clipped back to this layer, and again simply just brush that in to give the sense of the third dimension. So if we look at those as a group, you can see that the balloon looks as though it's being lit by this sun, and because it's quite small in the frame, let's move back here, we can get away with that lack of quality. And then finally, just a slight contrast adjustment to give the image a little bit of overall pizzazz, and we can make something that started off as being a fairly poor quality image, we can add that into our working image as long as it's quite small, and we adjust the lighting to suit. So let's move on now from this image where we've added a fairly simple element into something much more complicated. And this image that I created, and I put this together from a number of different elements, and I had in mind at the very outset that I wanted to create something that spoke to the story of pollution in the modern world. And so before I even started, I had in mind that I had a couple of elements that I wanted to use. And as my if we go back down and look at the really original parts of this image, I started off with this part of an image which was taken from here, which was a photograph of a factory in a place called Oberon outside of Sydney, and it was photographed right on the edge of dusk, and we had quite a heavy fog coming in, and so I had this quite misty, ethereal look to it. And you'll see here that I've done a little bit of perspective correction on the original to get the verticals looking straight, and then I've brought that into this image. And you'll see here that I've actually made a selection of, when I copied that, I didn't want this part of the image brought in, and I had in mind how I would add this together. And the second part was, I had another layer that I brought in from an image from Iceland where I have a nice stream in the foreground, and I didn't really want that waterfall in the background, but I had some hills and some rocks in the foreground. I had in mind that I could make those work together. So the first thing I did was make a selection on this layer, and if I hold down Alt and click on the mask, you'll see that I made a bit of a selection here of these hills, and then I basically had to paint in the rest of it to form the edge of the selection. So then I had an element, a couple of elements put together that sort of looked as though they could work together. So at this point I was happy to proceed and spend a bit more time building up the image. And the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to change the aspect of this river and stream in the foreground, because I wanted to portray the idea of pollution and the effects of pollution. I didn't want the grass to be nice and green and lush, so I did a hue saturation adjustment, and I just changed the hue till I got this sort of dead rusty looking color, and I dropped the saturation back a little bit so that it looked as though it was not thriving, it was dying, and that then started to give me the feel that I was looking for. And then the next thing I looked at was this lovely pristine stream. If it was being polluted by this factory, I didn't want it to look nice and pristine, so I brought in a couple of layers from another location. Let's just disable that layer mask and go from hard light to normal. You'll see there's a bit of slime on some water which I photographed some time ago, and I like this effect of the slime, so let's just go back to hard light, and add the filter back in, add the mask back in. You can see it started to add a bit of slime into the river, but then I ran out of slime down here, so I needed another version of that and brought that in, and again just with a mask painted that in so that I had a bit of a slimy effect on the water. It still didn't quite work, so I realized I needed to do a bit more work on that. And the first thing I did was I tried a color fill layer, and you'll see here if I double click on that, I selected a fairly dark green color, and I did that by creating a new color fill layer or solid layer from the adjustments menu down here. Now strangely, it doesn't appear in the adjustments menu. You have to locate it from the bottom of the toolbar. In any event, I brought in this green layer and painted a mask in to try and give the effect of pollution. It sort of had a bit of an effect, but it wasn't quite right. So then I thought I'll do the same thing, but this time I'll do it a bit more of a rusty brown color, more polluted like. Yes, that started to improve it a little bit. Let's just go up further. I got to this point and I thought, well, it's starting to come together, but what I needed to do was to add a texture layer. Now, this is a texture layer that I brought in. We're in soft light at 18% blend. If I go normal, 100%, you'll see that it's just a surface of concrete or sandstone or something like that. And what I've done is I've blurred it slightly because I didn't want the hard edges of this texture to overpower the image, and then I've painted on a bit of a mask. I didn't want it on the river, so let's go back to what I had it on, which was fairly low opacity. It was just really designed to bring in a textural element that would start to blend the two images together. And I didn't feel that that quite worked well enough, so I brought in another texture layer. This time, I think we had soft light. Yes, soft light. And 13% opacity. Again, it's another concrete or similar texture. And all of this is doing is bringing in some texture that will add an overall feeling to the image that blends them together. Having done that, I was starting to feel a little better with this image, and then I decided I would place a vignette around it because I liked the idea of the nighttime feel about the factory, and I needed to bring this element in a bit more using a fairly aggressive curves layer and painting in the mask around the edge. I got the image looking a little bit darker, but then at this point I decided I need some sort of an overall texture and color treatment that will blend these together a little more. And what I did was I made a composite layer and went into the topaz filters and used a filter called Mechanic Grime, which then started to really give me the feel that I wanted. And I've blended this at normal, but only 62% opacity. At full strength, I thought it was a little too dark, so I just brought that back to 62. And you can see now it's starting to look as though all of the colors, the textures, and the lighting is starting to blend together. It's not yet perfect, but it's getting there. And so at each step, you look at the image and see what needs to be done. And I realized that this water was still looking a little bit washed out and pale, so I made another version of the color fill layer, added more water or more brown color, painted that in using, it looks like I used a selection there of that water, and filled that in, made it a little darker, a little muddier. And then I started to look at the lighting, and I decided that the highlights needed a little bit of lightening. So let's have a look at the selection. I made a selection of the highlights using the select color range and selecting highlights. You can see there that there's the selection. I'm not going to do that now, I've already done it. I used the selection of the highlights, and then I feathered it using the feathering option in the layer panel. And what I did was then just bring those highlights up a little brighter, only fairly subtle, but brought the highlights up in the water. I wanted a little more contrast there. starting to get a little bit better. I still felt it needed something more. So the next thing I did was I made another duplicate layer using the Control Alt Shift and E, and this time used the Nik Color Efex Pro fog filter. I wanted a little more sense of fog, but you can see I've just painted it in very slightly around those lights. I wanted it more of the foggy, misty, polluted, smoky, that sort of a feel, and I think that added a certain amount to it. And then we're getting pretty close now, but I needed to work on the lighting because I've got strong lights on this factory building, and I've got some trees silhouetted here. I needed some shadows around those trees, and I needed to fill in some of the shadows here and add some more highlights onto these rocks. So I did this using a series of layers, and I'll just turn these off individually. The first thing I did was make a fairly aggressive darkening curve and paint in the areas that I felt needed to be darker, which is some of these rocks in the foreground and some of the edges of the bank of the river and so forth. You'll see here that just doing that has added a lot of three-dimensionality into the bank here particularly, and around the rocks. And of course, once you paint in some shadows, you're going to also need to paint in some lighting, but I still wasn't quite happy with here. This didn't really gel. There should have been stronger shadows here, so I made another curves adjustment, and this time you'll see there's no adjustment on the curves. All I've used here is the multiply blending mode, and again using my mask I've just painted in those shadows. And using the multiply blend mode, you get a much stronger effect of the shadows, and that's what I needed there. You'll see here without the shadows it doesn't quite look believable. With the shadows painted in, it now looks believable. And then finally, using a lightening curves adjustment, I painted in some more highlights, and looking at the mask, I've painted in highlights around some of the rocks and some of the other areas of the image, just to give the sense of a few highlights appearing here and there, here and on some of these rocks that would have been catching the light from the factory building in the distance. So now it's really starting to look as though it's getting believable. And then looking around the image, I had a good look over it, and I decided that this area here of red somehow had gotten a little bit too overdone. So a simple hue saturation adjustment, looking at the reds, reducing the reds quite considerably, but again just painting them in on that particular area that looked overdone. And then I was looking at this image and deciding that this was pretty much done, and then I thought, well, I don't really like this light right at the edge of the frame. I would have liked to have had a little bit more height in this image, and so what I did was I made a duplicate layer and used the perspective warp tool, which is the tool down here, perspective warp, which I've covered in another video. I just moved the whole image down, compressed this area at the bottom, added a little bit more space at the top, and using the content aware fill and the clone tools, I gave myself a little bit of space at the top, and I just felt that light right on the edge was too much of a bother, and so I just brought that down, and that gave me a little better perspective. And then finally, just about done, I decided I needed a little bit more contrast in that water. It really needed to look grungy, and that's what I did with just another curves adjustment, fairly aggressively darkening the lower tones and painting that in just to give the effect of this darker water. And there we have it. That's that complicated image, but by building it up piece by piece, reviewing it, looking at the lighting, looking at how you blend the elements together, and then using in particular things like a filters like the topaz filters and some color fill layers and textures, you can then really start to blend those elements together, and then they start to look as though they belong there. So that's a look at composites. I hope that's all been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.